Sir, you need to understand that people like you don't belong in spaces like this no matter what kind of ticket you think you have. The words hit the air like a slap cutting through the gentle hum of Denver International Airport's premium terminal on what had started as the most beautiful Sunday afternoon Damon Washington could remember. Just 4 hours earlier, he had crossed the finish line of the Denver Marathon with tears streaming down his face, not from exhaustion, but from the overwhelming sense that his mother was running beside him for every one of those 26.2 miles, cheering him on from wherever strong women go when their work on Earth is finally done. Now he sat in one of the leather armchairs that dotted the marble-floored premium terminal, his athletic frame still relaxed despite the confrontation brewing around him, wearing the same gray Nike running shorts that had carried him through the streets of Denver. The same moisture-wicking blue shirt that still bore the honest evidence of 3 hours and 47 minutes of determined effort. The finisher's medal hung around his neck like a badge of honor, its ribbon slightly frayed from where it had rubbed against his shirt during those final grueling miles when his legs wanted to quit but his heart remembered why he was running. Damon looked up at the woman standing over him with eyes that held no anger, no defensiveness, just the kind of steady calm that comes from 39 years of learning that dignity isn't something other people can take from you unless you hand it over willingly. His hands remained folded in his lap, his breathing even, his entire posture suggesting someone who had faced challenges far more significant than an airport supervisor with misplaced authority, and had emerged stronger each time. "I have a confirmed first-class ticket," he said quietly, his voice carrying the controlled strength that had guided Washington logistics through 15 years of growth from his mother's single food truck to a company that now employed over 15,000 people and generated $2.8 billion in annual revenue. Flight 382 to Atlanta, Seat 1A. 20 feet away, 9-year-old Emma Chen looked up from the coloring book she had been working on while her grandmother Grace dozed in the chair beside her, and something about the tension in the adult voices made her small stomach tighten with worry. Emma had been traveling since she was old enough to walk, accompanying her grandmother on visits to relatives scattered across the country, and she had developed the kind of sensitivity to adult emotions that comes from spending so much time in grown-up spaces where children learn to read the room before they fully understand what they're reading. The man in running clothes didn't look scary to Emma, not like some of the loud businessmen who talked too loudly on their phones, or the impatient travelers who pushed past without saying "excuse me." This man looked tired in the good way, like her grandfather after he finished working in his garden, tired but satisfied with something accomplished. And he was wearing a medal which Emma knew meant he had done something difficult and important, because her school gave out medals for reading contests and math competitions and other things that required you to try really hard. "Did you run in a race?" Emma asked, her voice carrying clearly across the space between them with the fearless curiosity that adults often lose but children guard like treasure. Damon's expression softened immediately as he turned toward the small voice, finding a girl with dark hair pulled back in neat braids and eyes that sparkled with genuine interest rather than judgment. "I did," he said, and something about talking to someone who saw a medal before she saw anything else about him made his chest feel lighter. "I ran the Denver Marathon this morning." "That's really far," Emma exclaimed, closing her coloring book and giving Damon her complete attention. "Why did you run so far? Did you win?" Damon smiled, the first real smile he had managed since the woman with the supervisor badge had started treating him like an intruder in a space he had every right to occupy. "I ran for my mom," he said simply. "She died 2 years ago, and running helps me feel close to her. I didn't win the race, but I finished it, which was what mattered." Emma nodded with the solemnity that children bring to discussions of important things they don't fully understand, but recognize as meaningful. "My grandfather is sick," she said. "That's why we're going to see him." Grandma says sometimes the most important thing is just showing up and being there. Your grandmother is a very smart woman, Damon replied, glancing toward the older woman who was beginning to stir in her chair, drawn from her light sleep by the sound of her granddaughter's voice. And you're going to make your grandfather very happy just by being there. Grace Chen opened her eyes and immediately assessed the situation with the quick awareness of someone who had spent decades navigating airports and understanding when conversations between strangers and her granddaughter were welcome versus when they required intervention. What she saw was a tired but kind-looking man in athletic clothes having the sort of genuine conversation with Emma that suggested good character and patience with children, which in Grace's experience were reliable indicators of a person worth knowing. Emma Honey let the gentleman rest, Grace said gently, but her tone carried more politeness than genuine concern. It's perfectly fine, Damon assured her. Your granddaughter was asking about my marathon medal. She's very good company. Grace smiled, recognizing in Damon's voice the same qualities that had attracted Emma's attention. She's always been curious about people and their stories. I'm Grace Chen, and this chatterbox is Emma. Damon Washington, he replied, half rising from his chair in a gesture of respect that Grace noticed and appreciated. It's nice to meet you both. From across the terminal, Brittany Morrison watched this interaction with growing irritation that settled in her stomach like food that wouldn't digest properly. At 34, Brittany had worked for Skylink Airlines for 7 years, climbing from gate agent to terminal supervisor through what she considered unwavering dedication to maintaining the standards that separated premium passengers from the chaos of general airport seating. Her platinum blonde hair was pulled back in the kind of severe bun that suggested efficiency and authority, and her supervisor badge caught the afternoon light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows as she stood with her arms crossed, studying the scene before her. To Brittany's eye, everything about Damon Washington's presence in her premium terminal violated the unspoken rules that kept exclusive spaces functioning properly. The running clothes were obviously inappropriate for a first-class environment, regardless of whatever ticket he claimed to have. The casual conversation with other passengers suggested someone who didn't understand the discreet professional atmosphere that premium travelers expected. Most importantly, his entire demeanor suggested someone who belonged in general seating with the families and college students and budget travelers who couldn't afford the elevated experience that first-class passengers paid premium prices to access. Brittany had seen this before. Passengers who somehow obtained upgraded tickets through points or company bookings, but who clearly didn't belong in spaces designed for business executives and successful professionals. These passengers inevitably made other travelers uncomfortable with their loud conversations, inappropriate clothing, and general failure to understand the subtle social contracts that governed premium travel experiences. The man talking to the Chinese child and her grandmother was exactly this type of passenger, and Brittany was going to address the situation before it disrupted the carefully maintained atmosphere that her paying first-class customers deserved. "Ma'am," came a voice from behind Brittany, causing her to turn toward Jake Sullivan, the 28-year-old security officer who had been patrolling the terminal and had noticed her focused attention on the seating area. Jake was relatively new to airport security, having joined Skylink's team 6 months earlier after a brief stint in retail loss prevention. But he had quickly learned that supporting supervisors like Brittany Morrison was essential for advancement in airport operations. "Is there a situation developing that needs security attention?" Brittany glanced back toward Damon, who was now showing Emma his marathon medal and explaining something about the race route through downtown Denver. "We may have a passenger who's confused about which terminal he belongs in," she said, her voice carrying the kind of professional authority that Jake had learned to respect and support. "I'm going to verify his booking status and make sure he understands our premium terminal policies." Jake nodded with the eager compliance of someone still establishing himself in a new job and anxious to demonstrate his value to experienced supervisors who could influence his career trajectory. "Would you like me to stand by while you handle the passenger interaction?" he asked, his hand instinctively moving to the radio clipped to his belt. "That would be helpful," Brittany replied, though her attention remained fixed on Damon Washington, who was now laughing at something Emma had said about marathon runners being like superheroes who run instead of fly. The sound of his laughter carried across the terminal with the kind of genuine warmth that made other passengers glance over with involuntary smiles, but to Brittany's ear it sounded too loud, too casual, too inconsistent with the understated professional atmosphere that premium passengers expected. Dr. Patricia Williams looked up from the medical journal she had been reading while waiting for her flight to Atlanta, drawn by the sound of a child's delighted giggle and an adult's patient responses to what sounded like an interrogation about running technique and training schedules. At 52, Dr. Williams had spent the weekend in Denver presenting research at a cardiology conference, and she was looking forward to returning to her practice in Atlanta, where Monday morning would bring the familiar challenges of patient consultations and surgical procedures that had defined her professional life for the past 20 years. What caught Dr. Williams's attention wasn't just the conversation between the marathon runner and the child, but the way the airport supervisor seemed to be studying their interaction with the kind of focused intensity that suggested official interest rather than casual observation. Dr. Williams had grown up in Alabama during the 1970s and 1980s, and while her family had considered themselves progressive for their time and place, she had still absorbed lessons about when to speak up and when to remain quietly observant, when to get involved in other people's business, and when to focus on her own concerns and responsibilities. Those lessons had served her well throughout medical school and residency, where the ability to read social situations and understand unspoken power dynamics often determined who succeeded and who struggled. But they had also left her with a complicated relationship to confrontation that she was still working to understand even now, decades into a successful career that had given her financial security and professional respect that her younger self could never have imagined. Tyler Rodriguez adjusted his laptop screen to get better light for the video editing project he had been working on while waiting for his flight back to Boulder, where he was a junior at the University of Colorado, studying digital journalism with a focus on social media storytelling. At 20, Tyler had grown up understanding the power of real-time documentation to amplify voices and hold institutions accountable for their actions, and something about the developing situation across the terminal triggered the instincts he had been developing through 3 years of coursework and internship experience. Tyler was white with sandy brown hair and the kind of earnest expression that made people comfortable sharing their stories with him, a quality that his journalism professors had identified as essential for building sources and conducting interviews that revealed truth rather than just surface information. His backpack contained the tools that had become essential for his generation of storytellers: a high-end smartphone with professional camera capabilities, portable battery packs that could power equipment for hours, and editing software that could process and upload content within minutes of recording. The body language he was observing from across the terminal felt disturbingly familiar from countless viral videos he had studied in his media ethics courses. Interactions that began with official-sounding questions about policies and procedures, but gradually revealed themselves to be based on assumptions that had nothing to do with legitimate security concerns and everything to do with unconscious bias that became very conscious when subjected to scrutiny. Maya Patel finished processing the upgrade requests that had accumulated during the afternoon boarding rush and took a moment to observe the passenger interactions in her assigned gate area. At 31, Maya had been working for Skylink Airlines for 6 years, starting in baggage handling and working her way up to gate agent through night school classes and determination that had impressed her supervisors and earned her increasing responsibilities within the terminal operations team. Maya was Indian American with dark hair that she kept pulled back in a professional ponytail during work hours and brown eyes that missed very little of what happened in the premium terminal space that she helped manage. She took genuine pride in treating every passenger with respect and professionalism, regardless of their appearance, perceived social status, or the type of ticket they carried, because she had grown up in a family where hard work was respected, regardless of what clothes it required, and people were judged by their actions rather than their accessories. What Maya could see from her position behind the gate counter was that the man in running clothes had a legitimate boarding pass for Flight 382 Seat 1A, which she had processed herself during the afternoon check-in period. She could also see that Brittany Morrison was approaching him with the kind of focused attention that usually preceded passenger service issues that required careful documentation and sensitive handling. Though Maya couldn't understand what possible issue could exist with a passenger who was sitting quietly bothering no one and engaging in pleasant conversation with a child and her grandmother. Grace Chen had been traveling frequently for over 40 years, ever since her late husband's work had required family relocations that introduced her to airport security procedures and the subtle social dynamics that governed how different people were treated in institutional spaces. At 67, Grace had witnessed enough interactions between authority figures and passengers to recognize when official inquiries were based on legitimate concerns versus when they were based on assumptions that had more to do with appearance and bias than actual policy violations. Something about the way the blonde supervisor was studying Damon Washington reminded Grace of interactions she had witnessed decades earlier, when her husband had faced questions from hotel managers and restaurant hosts who seemed to find reasons to doubt his reservations or question his right to access spaces that his family's money had clearly purchased. The memory made Grace's stomach tighten with a familiar anxiety, not for herself, but for the kind man who had taken time to answer Emma's questions and share his story about running in memory of his mother. Emma looked up from her coloring book again, as she noticed the lady with the supervisor badge walking toward them, and something about the expression on the woman's face made Emma move slightly closer to her grandmother's chair. Emma had spent enough time in adult spaces to recognize when grown-ups were about to have the kind of conversation that involved serious voices and concerned faces. The kind of conversation that usually meant something was wrong even when she couldn't understand exactly what or why. Grandma Emma whispered, tugging gently on Grace's sleeve. "Is the lady going to be mean to the nice runner man?" Grace looked down at her granddaughter and then toward Brittany Morrison, who was now close enough that Grace could see the determined expression that suggested official business rather than casual passenger services. "I don't know, sweetheart," Grace replied quietly, though her tone carried the kind of protective concern that made Emma scoot even closer to her grandmother's side. Damon Washington noticed the change in atmosphere before he saw Brittany Morrison approaching the same way he had learned to read boardrooms and negotiation sessions and investor meetings, where the energy shifted subtly but unmistakably when someone decided to change the nature of the conversation from collaborative to confrontational. He had been enjoying his talk with Emma about marathon training and the mental discipline required to keep running when your body wanted to stop, but now he felt the familiar tightness in his shoulders that came when he sensed that his presence somewhere was about to become an issue that required careful navigation. "Excuse me, sir," Brittany Morrison said as she approached Damon's chair, her voice carrying the kind of professional courtesy that managed to sound both polite and unmistakably authoritative. "I'm Brittany Morrison, terminal supervisor for this premium boarding area, and I need to verify some information about your flight today." Damon looked up at Brittany with the same calm attention he brought to business meetings, where millions of dollars hung on his ability to read people accurately and respond appropriately to challenges that might or might not be what they initially appeared to be. Of course, he said, his voice maintaining the same steady tone he had used with Emma, though he was now fully alert to the fact that what had been a pleasant conversation was about to become something entirely different. "I'll need to see your boarding pass and identification." Brittany continued, extending her hand with the expectation of immediate compliance that came from 7 years of authority over passenger interactions in premium terminal spaces. We've been having issues with passengers accessing areas their tickets don't actually authorize, and I want to make sure there's no confusion about your seating assignment." Emma watched this interaction with growing confusion that showed clearly on her small face, because nothing about the official-sounding conversation matched what she understood about airports and airplane tickets from dozens of trips with her grandmother. "Grandma," she whispered, though her voice was loud enough for Damon to hear, "don't people show their tickets when they get on the airplane? Why does the lady need to see it now?" Grace placed a protective hand on Emma's shoulder while keeping her attention focused on the developing situation. Understanding that her granddaughter's innocent question had highlighted exactly what felt wrong about Brittany Morrison's approach to a passenger who was clearly doing nothing more than sitting quietly and waiting for his flight like everyone else in the terminal. Damon reached into his black duffel bag and produced a boarding pass that he handed to Brittany without comment, though Tyler Rodriguez noticed from across the terminal that there was something about the runner's body language that suggested complete confidence in whatever documentation he was providing. The boarding pass was clearly legitimate, processed through Skylink's standard reservation system, showing Flight 382 to Atlanta Seat 1A with all the proper verification codes and booking references that distinguished genuine tickets from fraudulent ones. Brittany examined the boarding pass with the intensity of someone hoping to find evidence that would justify her suspicions, but even her careful scrutiny couldn't identify any irregularities in documentation that had been processed through the airline's own computer systems. The ticket was legitimate, but legitimacy wasn't really the issue for Brittany, who had already decided that appropriateness was a more important consideration than technical policy compliance. "This could be fraudulent," she announced loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear her voice, carrying the kind of authority that was designed to make people assume that official suspicions were based on expertise rather than assumptions. "We've had problems recently with passengers using stolen credit cards to book flights they can't actually afford, and these situations require additional verification procedures." Tyler Rodriguez felt his journalistic instincts activate as he processed Brittany's statement, and realized that what he was witnessing had moved beyond routine passenger service into territory that seemed designed to create suspicion rather than resolve it. Tyler quietly opened his phone's camera app and began recording, positioning the device to capture both audio and video without being obvious about his documentation, understanding that if the situation continued to develop in the direction it seemed to be heading, having real-time evidence might become crucial for holding people accountable for their actions. Dr. Williams felt her stomach tighten as she listened to Brittany Morrison's public announcement about fraudulent tickets and stolen credit cards allegations that seemed designed to cast doubt on the marathon runner's character rather than address any specific policy violation. Dr. Williams had witnessed enough interactions in professional settings to recognize when someone was being treated differently based on assumptions that had nothing to do with their actual behavior, and something about Brittany's approach reminded her uncomfortably of situations she had observed in hospitals where certain patients faced additional scrutiny that seemed to correlate more with their appearance than their medical needs. "Ma'am," Damon said quietly, his voice carrying the controlled strength that had guided him through countless business negotiations where remaining calm under pressure often determined whether deals succeeded or failed. "Could you explain specifically what appears fraudulent about a boarding pass that was processed through your own airline's reservation system?" The question was simple and direct, but it carried implications that Brittany wasn't prepared to address, because answering honestly would require her to admit that her suspicions were based on assumptions about who belonged in premium spaces, rather than evidence of any actual policy violations. "Sir, we have security procedures that require additional verification when passengers don't meet standard profiles for premium service access," she replied, though her explanation raised more questions than it answered. Emma tugged on her grandmother's sleeve again, her confusion growing as she tried to understand why the conversation sounded so serious when the nice man with the medal seemed to have done exactly what grown-ups were supposed to do by showing his ticket when asked. "Grandma, what's wrong with his ticket?" Emma asked in the kind of stage whisper that children use when they're trying to be quiet, but can't quite manage it. "Nothing's wrong with his ticket," Sweetheart Grace replied, her voice carrying clearly across the small space and adding another layer of witness testimony to a situation that was becoming increasingly difficult for Brittany to justify through official-sounding procedures and security protocols. Maya Patel had been watching the interaction from her gate counter position, and her professional training told her that intervening in supervisor-level passenger services could be problematic for her career advancement. But her personal ethics told her that remaining silent while watching a passenger being treated unfairly would be even more problematic for her ability to look at herself in the mirror each morning. Maya stepped away from her counter and approached the group gathered around Damon's chair. "Ms. Morrison." Maya said respectfully but firmly, "I processed Mr. Washington's boarding pass myself during this afternoon's check-in period. His ticket is completely legitimate. He paid full price for first-class service, and his reservation shows no irregularities or flags that would justify additional security screening." Brittany turned toward Maya with obvious irritation at having her authority questioned by a gate agent who was supposed to support supervisor-level decisions rather than undermine them in front of passengers. "Maya, return to your counter and let me handle passenger service issues that are outside your area of responsibility," she said, though her tone carried more frustration than genuine authority. "Respectfully, Ms. Morrison, ensuring that passengers receive appropriate service is exactly within my area of responsibility," Maya replied, her voice shaking slightly with nervousness, but her conviction remaining clear. "Mr. Washington has done nothing wrong, and treating him differently than other passengers raises questions that I don't think serve the airline's interests." Tyler Rodriguez had been quietly live-streaming the interaction through his social media accounts, and he noticed that viewer numbers were climbing steadily as word spread across platforms about a potential discrimination situation developing in real time at Denver International Airport. The comments sections were filling with reactions ranging from outrage to legal advice to demands for the names and badge numbers of the airline employees involved. Jake Sullivan appeared at Brittany's shoulder with the kind of supportive presence that he had learned was expected when supervisors dealt with challenging passenger situations, though he was beginning to sense that the challenge in this case might not be coming from the passenger who was sitting calmly and answering questions politely. "Ms. Morrison, is this passenger refusing to comply with security verification procedures?" He asked his question, designed to establish official justification for whatever escalation might be necessary. Officer Sullivan Damon said, reading Jake's name tag with the same careful attention he brought to learning the names of everyone involved in business meetings where relationships and respect often mattered more than formal authority. "I want you to be very clear about what's happening here. I'm sitting quietly in a space my ticket grants me access to. I've provided all requested documentation, and your supervisor is making public allegations about fraud and stolen credit cards without presenting any evidence to support those claims." Jake looked around the terminal and noticed that several passengers were now watching the interaction with obvious interest, some holding phones that appeared to be recording, others simply observing with the kind of focused attention that suggested they recognized something significant was developing. The situation felt more complex than the routine passenger service issues he had been trained to handle, and Jake was beginning to understand that his response might have consequences that extended beyond the immediate interaction. Jake Sullivan felt the weight of multiple sets of eyes watching him as he tried to assess a situation that had clearly moved beyond routine passenger verification into territory that his 6 months of airport security training hadn't adequately prepared him to navigate. "Sir," he said, though his voice carried less confidence than he intended, "we have protocols for passengers who may be accessing premium services through irregular means, and we need to ensure that all our first-class travelers are properly authorized to use these facilities." Damon remained seated, but something in his posture shifted slightly, not toward aggression or defensiveness, but toward the kind of focused attention that successful business leaders develop when they recognize that a situation is about to reveal important information about the character and competence of the people they're dealing with. Officer Sullivan: I want you to state clearly what specific irregular means you believe I've used to access services that I've paid for with my own money through your airline's standard booking procedures. The directness of the question created exactly the kind of accountability that Jake wasn't prepared to handle, because answering honestly would require him to admit that his assumptions were based on appearance and personal judgment, rather than evidence of any actual policy violations, while answering dishonestly would create inconsistencies that the growing number of witnesses could easily document and challenge. Emma Chen had been watching this adult conversation with increasing distress. Not because she understood all the words being used, but because she could recognize the tone and body language that meant grown-ups were being unfriendly to each other for reasons that didn't make sense to her 9-year-old understanding of fairness and kindness. "Why are they being mean to the nice man who runs?" she asked her grandmother, her voice carrying that particular note of childhood confusion when adult behavior violates the simple rules of treating people nicely that children learn before they learn about the complicated social dynamics that adults use to justify being unkind. Grace Chen felt her heart breaking a little as she watched her granddaughter struggle to understand a situation that Grace herself recognized all too well from decades of witnessing how certain people were treated in institutional spaces where authority figures felt empowered to make assumptions about who belonged and who didn't. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes about other grown-ups, Grace said gently, though she knew the explanation was inadequate for the complexity of what Emma was witnessing. "But his ticket is good, right?" Emma persisted, her child's logic cutting through the official-sounding procedures and security protocols to focus on the simple fact that seemed most important to her: understanding of airports and airplane travel. "People with good tickets get to sit in the airplane chairs, don't they?" Grace looked at her granddaughter and then at Damon Washington, who was handling the increasingly hostile questioning with a dignity and patience that reminded Grace of her late husband's approach to discrimination he had faced throughout his career in engineering. Always maintaining his composure, even when others seemed determined to make him prove his right to occupy spaces he had clearly earned access to through his professional achievements and financial resources. Tyler Rodriguez had been discreetly narrating the developing situation for his live stream audience, which had grown to over 800 viewers as social media algorithms began recognizing and amplifying content that was generating high engagement through comments, shares, and reactions. "This is absolutely incredible," Tyler whispered into his phone, positioning the camera to capture both the main participants and the growing crowd of observers. Airport security is questioning a marathon runner's right to sit in first-class seating despite his having legitimate documentation, and a 9-year-old child is asking better questions than the adults with badges are managing to answer. The live stream comments had become a waterfall of reactions ranging from legal advice to outrage to demands for the airline's corporate contact information, with viewers sharing the stream across multiple platforms and encouraging others to witness what appeared to be clear discrimination happening in real time at a major American airport. Dr. Patricia Williams closed her medical journal and stood up from her chair, unable to remain a passive observer as she watched a fellow passenger being treated in a way that violated every principle of fairness and respect that she had learned throughout her personal and professional life. At 52, Dr. Williams had spent enough time in professional environments where subtle discrimination was often disguised as legitimate policy enforcement to recognize when official procedures were being used as cover for bias that would be illegal if expressed directly. "Excuse me," Dr. Williams said, her voice carrying the authority that came from decades of making life and death decisions in emergency situations and commanding respect from medical colleagues who had learned to trust her judgment under pressure. "I'm Dr. Patricia Williams, and I've been sitting 20 feet away watching this entire interaction. This gentleman has shown his legitimate boarding pass. He's answered every question politely and he's done absolutely nothing that would justify the treatment he's receiving from your staff." Brittany Morrison turned toward Dr. Williams with the kind of irritation that comes from having authority questioned by people who don't understand the complexities of airport security and premium passenger services. "Ma'am, this is an operational matter that requires professional judgment about potential security concerns, and we appreciate passengers allowing our trained staff to handle situations that may not be apparent to casual observers." "I'm not a casual observer," Dr. Williams replied firmly, her medical training having taught her to remain calm under pressure, while still advocating clearly for patients who couldn't advocate for themselves. "I've been watching trained staff treat a paying passenger differently than every other person in this terminal, and the only difference I can identify is his appearance and his choice to wear athletic clothing after completing a marathon this morning." Emma looked up at the new grown-up who was speaking in defense of the nice runner man, and something about Dr. Williams's willingness to stand up and say that the treatment wasn't fair made Emma feel a little braver about expressing her own confusion about the situation. "My grandma says people should be nice to each other," Emma announced to the growing circle of adults, her voice carrying the kind of moral clarity that children bring to situations where right and wrong seem obvious, even when adults are making everything complicated. Jake Sullivan was beginning to realize that the situation had attracted far more attention than routine passenger verification procedures typically generated, and the presence of multiple witnesses who seemed to be supporting the passenger rather than the airport staff suggested that his initial assessment of the security concerns might have been based on incomplete information. "Sir, we're just following standard procedures for ensuring that premium facility access is properly authorized," he said, though his explanation sounded increasingly hollow even to his own ears. Maya Patel had been documenting the interaction in the incident log that gate agents were required to maintain for any passenger service issues, but she was becoming increasingly concerned that what she was witnessing and recording might need to be escalated beyond routine customer service procedures to management levels that could address what appeared to be discriminatory treatment of a passenger who had done nothing wrong. Ms. Morrison-Maya said, her voice carrying more confidence now that Dr. Williams had also spoken up in support of appropriate passenger treatment. "I think we should contact terminal management before this situation develops any further. Mr. Washington has provided all requested documentation. Multiple witnesses have confirmed that he's done nothing inappropriate and continuing to question his right to access services he's paid for seems likely to create the kind of incident that requires management review and possible legal consultation." Brittany felt cornered by the growing number of passengers who were questioning her professional judgment and undermining her authority in front of other travelers who expected airport staff to maintain control over premium facility access and security procedures. Her response revealed the dangerous intersection of prejudice and power when faced with accountability from people who refuse to accept assumptions disguised as official policies. "I want him removed from this terminal immediately," Brittany announced to Jake Sullivan, her voice carrying across the premium lounge with unmistakable command. "I don't care what documentation he claims to have or what witnesses want to interfere with security procedures. He doesn't belong here, and I'm not going to allow paying first-class passengers to be made uncomfortable by someone who clearly doesn't understand appropriate behavior for premium aviation facilities." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fired weapon, creating a moment of stunned silence that seemed to stretch across the entire premium terminal as passengers and staff processed what Brittany Morrison had just said. Even Jake Sullivan, who had been prepared to support his supervisor's authority, felt something shift in his stomach as he recognized that the situation had moved from questionable passenger verification into territory that would be very difficult to defend if anyone asked him to explain his actions in writing. Officer David Rodriguez had been patrolling Terminal A when he received Jake's request for backup assistance with what was described as a potentially uncooperative passenger situation. But as Rodriguez approached the premium terminal and observed the scene from a distance, his 15 years of law enforcement experience told him that what he was seeing looked more like a power struggle between staff and a passenger than any kind of legitimate security threat. Rodriguez was Hispanic, 45 years old, and the son of immigrants who had taught him to respect both authority and justice, while understanding the crucial difference between the two concepts when they came into conflict with each other. He had worked in airport law enforcement long enough to distinguish between genuine security concerns that required immediate intervention and personal conflicts that had been elevated to security issues by people who confused their assumptions with professional judgment, Officer Sullivan Rodriguez said as he joined the group gathered around Damon Washington's chair, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone accustomed to de-escalating situations that other people had allowed to spiral beyond their ability to manage effectively. What specific security threat are we addressing here, and what evidence do we have that requires law enforcement intervention? Jake found himself struggling to articulate a coherent response that would justify calling for backup without admitting that his assessment of the situation had been based more on supporting his supervisor's assumptions than on identifying actual policy violations or security concerns. We have a passenger who's been questioned about his right to access premium terminal facilities, and there are concerns about whether his documentation supports his claimed authorization for first-class services, Jake replied. Though even as he spoke the words, he could hear how weak his explanation sounded. Rodriguez looked at Damon Washington, who was sitting calmly with his hands folded in his lap, and then at the boarding pass that Brittany Morrison was still holding, and then at the growing crowd of passengers who appeared to be supporting the questioned traveler rather than the airport staff who were questioning him. "Has the passenger shown identification and boarding documentation?" Rodriguez asked. "Yes, but we believe additional verification is required because his appearance doesn't match typical premium passenger profiles," Jake replied, and as soon as the words left his mouth, he realized that he had just provided exactly the kind of statement that would be impossible to defend if anyone asked him to justify his law enforcement actions based on professional training rather than personal assumptions. Rodriguez felt his jaw tighten as he processed Jake's explanation, recognizing the language that people used when they were trying to make discrimination sound like legitimate security procedure. "Officer Sullivan, what specific training have you received that teaches you to identify security threats based on passenger appearance rather than behavior or documentation irregularities?" Emma Chen had been listening to this grown-up conversation with increasing confusion and distress, not understanding all the official-sounding words, but recognizing that the police officer who had just arrived seemed to be asking better questions than the other adults with badges had been asking. "Grandma?" she whispered, though her voice was loud enough for everyone in the immediate area to hear. "Why do the airport people think there's something wrong with how the nice man looks?" "Grace." Chen felt tears forming in her eyes as she listened to her granddaughter's innocent question, cut through all the official procedures and security protocols to identify the fundamental issue that everyone was dancing around without addressing directly. "I don't know, sweetheart," Grace replied, though her voice carried the weight of someone who understood exactly why certain people faced additional scrutiny in institutional spaces, regardless of their behavior or documentation. Damon Washington had remained seated throughout the escalating confrontation, but now he stood slowly and deliberately, not with anger or agitation, but with the quiet authority of someone who had decided that the time for passive cooperation had passed, and the moment for direct engagement had arrived. At 6 feet 2 inches, his presence commanded attention that had nothing to do with intimidation and everything to do with the kind of natural leadership that successful business executives develop through years of making difficult decisions under pressure. Officer Rodriguez Damon said, his voice carrying clearly across the terminal space that had grown quiet as other passengers stopped their conversations to focus on what appeared to be a decisive moment in whatever drama had been developing over the past 30 minutes. "I want you to understand exactly what has happened here, because I believe your professional judgment is about to be tested in ways that will define how this situation is remembered by everyone present." Rodriguez nodded, recognizing in Damon's tone the kind of controlled authority that suggested someone accustomed to being taken seriously in high-stakes situations where clear communication and accurate assessment of facts often determined outcomes that affected many people beyond the immediate participants. I completed the Denver Marathon this morning in memory of my deceased mother. Damon continued his words, carrying emotional weight that made several nearby passengers look up from their phones and magazines to give him their complete attention. I came to this terminal with a legitimate first-class ticket purchased with my own money through standard airline booking procedures. I sat quietly in a chair I had every right to occupy, engaging in pleasant conversation with a child who asked about my marathon medal. Tyler Rodriguez continued recording while whisper narrating for his live stream audience, which had grown to over 1,500 viewers as social media algorithms continued amplifying content that was generating intense engagement through shares, comments, and reactions from people who were witnessing what appeared to be clear discrimination being challenged in real time. Your colleagues have spent the past 45 minutes treating me like a criminal based solely on their assumptions about who belongs in premium airport spaces. Damon continued, his voice remaining steady, but carrying increasing intensity as he described the progression of events that had led to this confrontation. They have questioned documentation that your own airline's computer system processed without irregularities, made public allegations about fraud and stolen credit cards without presenting any evidence, and now demanded my removal from facilities I have paid to access. Dr. Williams stepped closer to the circle of people gathered around Damon, no longer content to observe from a distance, as she watched a fellow professional being treated in ways that violated every principle of fairness and respect that she had learned throughout her medical career. Officer Rodriguez, I'm a cardiologist from Atlanta, and I've been documenting this entire interaction, she said, holding up her phone to indicate that she had been recording. This gentleman has maintained perfect composure while being subjected to treatment that I have not seen directed toward any other passenger in this terminal today. Maya Patel had left her gate counter entirely drawn into the confrontation by her inability to remain professionally neutral while watching a passenger being mistreated by colleagues whose behavior reflected poorly on the airline that employed all of them. Officer Rodriguez was processed Mr. Washington's boarding pass myself, she said, her voice shaking with nervousness but her conviction clear. His reservation shows no irregularities. He paid full price for first-class service, and treating him differently than other passengers creates exactly the kind of discrimination liability that our training programs specifically warn us to avoid. Rodriguez looked around the terminal and realized that what had begun as a routine backup call had developed into a situation where his next decisions would be observed and evaluated by multiple witnesses who were actively documenting the interaction and sharing it across social media platforms that could amplify the consequences of those decisions far beyond the immediate airport environment. Mrs. Morrison Rodriguez said, addressing Brittany directly for the first time since arriving at the scene, I need you to articulate the specific policy violation that justifies removing a passenger who has provided legitimate documentation and maintained appropriate behavior throughout this interaction. Brittany felt trapped by the direct question and the growing number of witnesses who were clearly supporting the passenger rather than the airport staff, but she had invested too much authority in her position to back down without losing face in front of colleagues and travelers who expected her to maintain control over premium facility access and security procedures. Officer Rodriguez, I've been supervising premium terminal operations for 7 years, and I know inappropriate passenger behavior when I see it, Brittany replied, her voice carrying the kind of defensive authority that people use when they realize their position is weakening but can't figure out how to retreat gracefully. This passenger doesn't meet the standards that our first-class travelers expect, and I have the authority and responsibility to maintain the elevated experience that premium passengers pay for when they choose Skylink Airlines. Emma Chen looked up at her grandmother with eyes that were beginning to fill with tears, not because she was frightened, but because she was confused and sad that grown-ups were being mean to someone who had been so nice to her when she asked about his marathon medal. Grandma, can we help the nice man? she asked, her voice carrying that particular note of childhood distress when the adult world reveals itself to be less fair and kind than children believe it should be. Grace. Chen felt something powerful stirring in her chest as she looked at her granddaughter's concerned face, and then at Damon Washington, who was handling deliberate mistreatment with a dignity that reminded her of her late husband's response to similar discrimination he had faced throughout his engineering career, always maintaining his composure even when others seemed determined to make him prove his worth in ways that were never required of his white colleagues. "Yes, sweetheart, we can help," Grace said, her voice growing stronger with each word as she made the decision to stop being a passive observer and become an active participant in a situation that was testing everyone's character in ways that would be remembered long after the flights departed. Sometimes helping means speaking up when we see something that isn't right. Grace Chen stood up from her chair with the determined grace of someone who had lived through enough discrimination to recognize it instantly and had finally reached the point in her life where remaining silent felt more dangerous than speaking up. "Officer Rodriguez," she said, her voice carrying the authority that comes from decades of experience navigating institutional spaces where certain people were treated differently based on assumptions rather than behavior. "I'm Grace Chen, and my granddaughter and I have been sitting 20 feet away watching this entire interaction develop." Rodriguez nodded respectfully toward Grace, recognizing in her tone and posture the qualities that suggested someone whose testimony would carry significant weight if the situation continued to escalate toward formal complaints or legal proceedings. "Mr. Washington has been nothing but kind and patient throughout this ordeal," Grace continued, her voice carrying clearly across the terminal space as other passengers turned to listen to what sounded like important witness testimony. "He answered my granddaughter's questions about his marathon with the kind of gentle attention that speaks to good character. He provided all requested documentation without complaint, and he has maintained perfect composure while being treated in ways that would have justified anger from anyone subjected to such obvious unfairness." Tyler Rodriguez had been managing his live stream while simultaneously posting updates to Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, where the hashtag Denver Airport Discrimination was beginning to trend as thousands of people shared clips and commentary about what appeared to be clear racial profiling happening in real time at a major American airport. "This is unprecedented," Tyler whispered into his phone for his audience, which had grown to over 2,000 viewers. "We're watching multiple passengers stand up to challenge what appears to be obvious discrimination, and a 9-year-old child is asking questions that are exposing the complete lack of logic in the airport staff's behavior." The live stream comments had become a torrent of legal advice contact information for civil rights organizations and demands for the names and badge numbers of the airline employees involved, with viewers encouraging Tyler to ensure that his documentation was preserved and shared with news outlets that could provide broader coverage of the incident. Dr. Williams had been taking notes in addition to recording video, understanding that medical training in documentation and evidence preservation might prove valuable if the situation developed into formal complaints or legal proceedings that required detailed accounts of exactly what had been said and done by each participant. "Officer Rodriguez, I want to state clearly for the record that I have observed Mr. Washington's behavior throughout this incident, and at no point has he done anything that would justify the treatment he's receiving from airport staff," she said, her voice carrying the professional authority that had commanded respect in operating rooms and medical conferences throughout her career. Furthermore, Dr. Williams continued, "I have observed Miss Morrison and Officer Sullivan make statements and allegations that appear to be based on assumptions about Mr. Washington's appearance rather than evidence of any actual policy violations or security concerns, which raises serious questions about whether their actions comply with federal civil rights statutes that prohibit discrimination in public accommodations." Maya Patel realized that her decision to challenge her supervisor's authority had already put her job at risk. But watching multiple passengers courageously speak up in defense of appropriate treatment made her feel more confident that standing up for what was right might ultimately be safer than remaining silent while witnessing clear discrimination that could expose the airline to significant legal and financial consequences. Ms. Morrison. Maya said, her voice carrying more strength now that she was no longer the only employee questioning the appropriateness of the passenger treatment. Our customer service training specifically prohibits treating passengers differently based on appearance, and our diversity and inclusion policies require us to ensure that all travelers receive equal respect regardless of their clothing choices or perceived social status. Jake Sullivan was beginning to understand that his initial assessment of the situation had been completely wrong, and that his decision to support what he had thought were legitimate security procedures had actually put him in the position of defending discriminatory treatment that would be impossible to justify if anyone asked him to explain his actions based on professional law enforcement standards, rather than personal assumptions about passenger profiling. Officer Rodriguez Jake said, his voice reflecting the growing uncertainty of someone who was beginning to realize that his career might be at stake depending on how the next few minutes developed. Maybe we should step back and reassess whether there are actually any security issues that require law enforcement intervention here. Rodriguez looked at Jake with the kind of professional disappointment that experienced officers feel when they watch younger colleagues make mistakes that could have been avoided with better judgment and more careful attention to actual policies rather than personal biases disguised as security procedures. Officer Sullivan. That's exactly what I've been trying to determine since I arrived. Rodriguez replied, his tone carrying enough professional correction to make Jake understand that his handling of the situation had been inadequate from the beginning. So far, I've seen no evidence of security threats, policy violations, or inappropriate passenger behavior that would justify law enforcement involvement in what appears to be a customer service issue that has been unnecessarily escalated through poor judgment and questionable procedures. Emma Chen had been watching all the grown-ups stand up to defend the nice runner man, and something about seeing so many people willing to speak up for what was right made her feel brave enough to add her own voice to the conversation, even though she was just 9 years old and didn't understand all the official-sounding words that the adults were using. The nice man didn't do anything wrong, Emma announced to the circle of grown-ups, her voice carrying the kind of moral clarity that children bring to situations where adults have made everything complicated with procedures and policies and official-sounding explanations for treating people unfairly. He showed his ticket. He was nice to me when I asked about his medal, and he just wanted to sit in the chair until his airplane came. Why can't grown-ups just be nice to each other like kids are supposed to be? The question hung in the air with devastating simplicity, cutting through all the security protocols and premium passenger policies and professional procedures to focus on the fundamental issue of human decency that everyone present understood, but that only a child had been willing to state directly. Damon Washington looked down at Emma with an expression of such genuine gratitude and affection that several nearby passengers felt tears forming in their eyes, understanding that they were witnessing something profound about innocence and wisdom, and the power of speaking truth regardless of age or authority or social status. Emma Damon said gently, his voice carrying enough emotion that Tyler's live stream audience could hear it clearly through the phone's microphone. You're absolutely right that grown-ups should be nice to each other, and I want you to remember that sometimes the most important thing you can do is ask exactly the kind of question you just asked, because it helps everyone remember what really matters. Terminal manager Janet Foster had been in her office reviewing weekend passenger traffic reports when her assistant burst in with news that a discrimination incident was being live-streamed from the premium terminal and had already attracted thousands of viewers across multiple social media platforms. Janet was 53 years old with silver hair and the kind of professional composure that came from managing airport crises for over a decade. But as she hurried toward Terminal B, she understood that what awaited her would likely determine whether the rest of her career involved damage control or unemployment. Janet could see the crowd gathered around Gate B47 before she could hear the conversation and the body language of everyone involved, told her that whatever was happening had moved far beyond routine passenger service into territory that would require very careful handling to avoid the kind of viral controversy that could damage the airport's reputation and relationships with airline partners for years to come. "What exactly is the situation here?" Janet asked as she approached the group, though her tone suggested she already understood more than she wanted to admit about what her staff had created during what should have been a routine Sunday afternoon in premium passenger services. Brittany Morrison felt a surge of relief at seeing her supervisor arrive, believing that Janet's presence would provide institutional support for her authority and validate her decisions about maintaining premium terminal standards and security procedures. "Janet, we have a passenger who's been accessing first-class facilities without proper authorization, and when we attempted to verify his documentation, he became uncooperative and gathered other passengers to interfere with our security procedures." Janet Foster felt her heart sink as she processed Brittany's explanation and realized that her employee was describing exactly the kind of discriminatory passenger treatment that generated million-dollar lawsuits and federal civil rights investigations that could destroy careers and institutional reputations, regardless of whether the discrimination was intentional or simply the result of unconscious bias disguised as policy enforcement. Tyler Rodriguez had positioned his phone to capture Janet Foster's arrival and her response to the situation summary, understanding that how management handled the crisis would be crucial evidence for determining whether the discrimination was the result of individual employee bias or institutional policies that enabled and supported such treatment. "This is Janet Foster, the terminal manager, arriving on scene," Tyler narrated for his live stream audience, which had grown to over 2,500 viewers as news outlets and social media influencers began sharing his documentation of what appeared to be a textbook case of racial profiling at a major American airport. "Let's see how airport management responds to multiple witnesses documenting clear discrimination against a marathon runner who's done absolutely nothing wrong." Dr. Williams stepped forward to address Janet directly, understanding that management's response to witness testimony would reveal whether the airport was prepared to address the discrimination or attempt to defend it through institutional authority and legal positioning that prioritized protecting employees over acknowledging inappropriate treatment of passengers. "Ms. Foster, I'm Dr. Patricia Williams, and I've been documenting this entire incident, Doctor," Williams said, holding up her phone to indicate that she had video evidence of everything that had transpired. "Your employee has treated this gentleman differently than every other passenger in this terminal based solely on his appearance and her assumptions about who belongs in premium spaces, despite his having legitimate documentation and maintaining perfect behavior throughout an hour of deliberate harassment." Janet looked at Damon Washington, who was standing calmly beside his chair, with Emma Chen now positioned protectively near his side, and then at the multiple phones recording the interaction, and then at the growing crowd of passengers who were clearly supporting the discriminated traveler rather than the airport staff who had created the situation. "Sir, I sincerely apologize for any inconvenience you've experienced." Janet began using the kind of carefully neutral language that was designed to express concern without admitting liability for actions that could become evidence in legal proceedings. "I'm sure we can resolve this situation through appropriate channels and ensure that your travel experience meets the standards you expect from our facility." Damon looked at Janet with the same analytical attention he brought to business negotiations, where people's initial statements revealed their priorities and strategies for handling conflicts that could either be resolved through honest dialogue or would require more formal intervention through legal and regulatory channels. "Ms. Foster, there has been no inconvenience," Damon replied, his voice carrying the controlled strength that had guided Washington logistics through challenging negotiations and competitive business environments. "What has occurred here is deliberate discrimination based on racial assumptions about who belongs in premium airport spaces, and your staff has created exactly the kind of civil rights violation that federal law prohibits in public accommodations." Emma looked up at Damon and then at Ms. Foster, And something about the grown-up conversation reminded her of times when her teacher had to talk to students who had been mean to other students on the playground, except that in this case the grown-ups with the important jobs were the ones who had been mean to someone who was just trying to be nice and wait for his airplane. Ms. Foster Emma said, her 9-year-old voice carrying clearly across the terminal space as adult conversation stopped to listen to what the child had to say about the situation. The nice runner man wasn't doing anything wrong. He just wanted to sit in his chair and wait for his airplane, but your workers were mean to him for no good reason. Don't you think you should tell them to say sorry, Janet? Foster felt something twist in her stomach as she listened to a child's simple assessment of a situation that adult procedures and policies had turned into a potential legal and public relations disaster. Understanding that Emma's innocent question highlighted exactly what was wrong with how her staff had handled routine passenger services. Maya Patel had been standing slightly apart from the main group, but Janet's arrival prompted her to step forward and provide the kind of employee witness testimony that could either help resolve the situation through honest acknowledgement of inappropriate treatment, or make everything worse if management chose to defend discrimination rather than address it. Ms. Foster, I need to report that Mr. Washington's boarding pass is completely legitimate, processed through our standard reservation system with no irregularities or flags. Maya said, her voice reflecting both professional responsibility and personal courage in challenging supervisory decisions that had created liability for the airline. Ms. Morrison's treatment of this passenger violates our customer service training and creates exactly the kind of discrimination exposure that our diversity policies are designed to prevent. Officer Rodriguez had been observing Janet Foster's responses to witness testimony and employee reports, and his law enforcement experience told him that management's next decisions would determine whether the situation could be resolved through appropriate acknowledgement of mistakes or would escalate into formal complaints and federal investigations that could have consequences extending far beyond the immediate participants. Ms. Foster, I've reviewed this situation from a law enforcement perspective, and I can find no evidence of security threats, policy violations, or inappropriate passenger behavior that would justify the treatment this gentleman has received from your staff. Rodriguez said, his professional assessment carrying the weight of someone whose testimony would be credible in any formal proceedings that might develop from the incident. Jake Sullivan realized that Officer Rodriguez's statement effectively contradicted his own earlier support for Brittany Morrison's passenger verification procedures, and that his career in airport security might depend on his ability to demonstrate better judgment in his response to management's handling of the situation. Ms. Foster, I think I may have made some errors in assessing the security concerns here, Jake said, his voice reflecting the uncomfortable honesty of someone who was beginning to understand that covering up mistakes would be more dangerous than admitting them. Upon reflection, I don't believe there were legitimate grounds for questioning this passenger's right to access premium terminal facilities. Grace Chen had been holding Emma's hand throughout the conversation with Janet Foster, and something about watching her granddaughter's courage in speaking up for what was right inspired Grace to add her own voice to the testimony that was building a clear record of inappropriate treatment and the witnesses who had documented it. Ms. Foster, my granddaughter and I have been traveling through airports for years, and we've never seen a passenger treated the way your staff has treated Mr. Washington. Grace said, her voice carrying the authority that comes from decades of experience, recognizing discrimination when institutional authority is used to justify treating certain people differently, based on assumptions rather than behavior. Furthermore, Grace continued watching Emma's response to this situation has reminded me that children often understand fairness more clearly than adults who have learned to accept inappropriate treatment as normal business procedures. And I think you should listen very carefully to what she said about telling your employees to apologize for being mean to someone who was just trying to wait for his airplane like every other passenger in this terminal. Tyler Rodriguez had been managing multiple social media platforms while streaming the developing situation, and he noticed that major news outlets were beginning to contact him through direct messages requesting permission to use his footage for broader coverage of what appeared to be a significant civil rights incident at Denver International Airport. Brittany Morrison felt increasingly isolated as she listened to testimony from passengers, fellow employees, and law enforcement officers who were all contradicting her assessment of the passenger situation and essentially accusing her of discrimination that she believed was justified security procedure designed to maintain appropriate standards in premium aviation facilities. Ms. Foster: I want everyone here to understand that my decisions about passenger verification were based on 7 years of experience maintaining security and standards in premium terminal facilities. Brittany said, her voice carrying the defensive authority of someone who felt her professional competence being questioned by people who didn't understand the complexities of airport operations and passenger management. I stand by my assessment that this passenger's presence and behavior were inconsistent with the elevated experience that our first-class travelers expect and deserve. Janet Foster recognized in Brittany's statement exactly the kind of language that would be impossible to defend in court proceedings or federal investigations, because defending Brittany's position would require the airport to argue that appearance-based passenger screening was legitimate policy rather than prohibited discrimination. Damon Washington had remained patient throughout an hour of escalating confrontation, but Janet Foster's apparent hesitation to directly address the discrimination he had experienced suggested that management might be more interested in protecting employees than acknowledging inappropriate treatment of passengers who deserved better from institutional authority. Ms. Foster Damon said, his voice carrying the controlled intensity of someone who had given institutional authority every opportunity to respond appropriately and was now prepared to pursue other avenues for ensuring accountability. I want you to understand that your employee has spent the past hour publicly questioning my right to access spaces I've paid for, making allegations about fraud and stolen credit cards without evidence, and demanding my removal from facilities based solely on her assumptions about who belongs in premium airport environments. Tyler Rodriguez felt his phone vibrating with notifications as his live stream continued attracting viewers and generating the kind of engagement that social media algorithms amplified across platforms. Understanding that what had begun as documentation of potential discrimination was becoming a real-time case study in how institutions respond when their biases are exposed through witness testimony and video evidence. Emma Chen had been listening to the grown-up conversation with increasing confusion about why the airport lady seemed unwilling to simply tell her employees that they had been mean to someone who didn't deserve mean treatment. And Emma's 9-year-old sense of fairness told her that when people did wrong things, the first step toward making them right was acknowledging what had happened and saying sorry. Mrs. Foster, Emma said, her voice carrying the kind of innocent directness that children use when adult behavior doesn't make sense according to the simple rules of kindness and fairness that kids learn before they learn about institutional policies and legal liability concerns. Why is it so hard for you to tell your workers that they were wrong to be mean to the nice man? My teacher always tells us that when we hurt someone's feelings, we should say we're sorry and try to do better next time. Grace Chen felt tears forming in her eyes as she listened to her granddaughter apply playground logic to a situation that adults had complicated with procedures and policies that seemed designed to avoid accountability, rather than ensure appropriate treatment of people who deserved respect, regardless of their appearance or perceived social status. Dr. Williams had been taking detailed notes throughout Janet Foster's interaction with witnesses and employees, and her medical training and documentation told her that management's response pattern suggested institutional priorities that valued protecting authority over addressing discrimination, which could become important evidence if formal complaints or legal proceedings developed from the incident. Ms. Foster: I want to ensure that my documentation of this incident is complete and accurate, Dr. Williams said, holding up her phone to indicate that she was continuing to record the management response to witness testimony. Are you prepared to acknowledge that your employee treated Mr. Washington inappropriately? Or are you planning to defend discrimination that multiple witnesses have documented and that appears to violate federal civil rights statutes? Maya Patel realized that her job security might depend on her willingness to support management's handling of the situation, but her personal integrity told her that remaining silent while watching discrimination being defended through institutional authority would be more dangerous to her long-term career prospects than speaking up for appropriate passenger treatment. Ms. Foster, our customer service training specifically prohibits the kind of treatment Mr. Washington has received, and our diversity policies require us to ensure equal respect for all passengers regardless of appearance. Maya said, her voice reflecting professional responsibility that prioritized airline liability concerns over employee loyalty to supervisors who had created legal exposure through inappropriate passenger treatment. Officer Rodriguez understood that his law enforcement assessment of the situation would carry significant weight in any formal review of what had transpired, and his professional integrity required him to document clearly that he had found no evidence of security threats or policy violations that would justify the treatment Damon Washington had received from airport staff. Ms. Foster, based on my professional review of this situation, I can state definitively that this passenger has committed no policy violations, presented no security threats, and maintained appropriate behavior throughout an incident that appears to be based on assumptions rather than legitimate law enforcement concerns. Rodriguez said, his statement creating an official record that would be difficult for the airport to contradict if the situation escalated to formal complaints or federal investigation. Jake Sullivan felt the weight of his earlier mistakes pressing down on him as he realized that his career in airport security might depend on his willingness to acknowledge errors in judgment, rather than continue supporting positions that he now understood were based on bias rather than legitimate security procedures. Ms. Foster, I need to report that my initial assessment of this situation was incorrect, and that I found no evidence of security concerns that would justify questioning Mr. Washington's right to access premium terminal facilities. Jake said, his honesty reflecting the uncomfortable recognition that admitting mistakes might be safer than defending actions that could not be justified through professional law enforcement standards. Janet Foster looked around the terminal at the multiple phones recording her response to employee and witness testimony, understanding that her next words would likely be preserved and analyzed in ways that could determine whether her career survived the crisis or became another casualty of institutional discrimination that had been exposed through social media documentation. Mr. Washington, I want to assure you that we take all passenger concerns seriously, and we will review this situation through appropriate channels to ensure that our customer service standards meet the expectations that travelers deserve when they choose our facility, Janet said, using language that was carefully designed to suggest concern without admitting liability for actions that could become evidence in legal proceedings. Damon looked at Janet Foster with the same analytical attention he brought to business negotiations, where other people's responses revealed their priorities and strategies for handling conflicts that could either be resolved through honest dialogue or would require formal intervention through regulatory and legal channels that specialized in addressing institutional discrimination. Ms. Foster, I appreciate diplomatic language, but what I need from airport management is direct acknowledgement that your employee discriminated against me based on racial assumptions and clear commitment that such treatment will not be tolerated in facilities that serve the traveling public. Damon replied, his words carrying the controlled authority of someone who understood exactly what accountability looked like and was prepared to pursue it through whatever channels proved necessary. Tyler Rodriguez had been monitoring comments from his live stream audience, which included legal experts, civil rights advocates, and news producers who were providing real-time analysis of what they were witnessing and encouraging him to preserve all documentation for broader coverage and possible legal proceedings. Emma looked up at all the grown-ups who seemed to be having trouble saying simple things like "we're sorry" and "we'll do better," and her 9-year-old understanding of right and wrong told her that when people make mistakes that hurt other people, the first step toward fixing the problem is admitting what went wrong and promising to learn from it. "You know what, Miss Foster?" Damon said, his voice carrying a subtle shift in tone that suggested someone who had given institutional authority every reasonable opportunity to respond appropriately, and was now prepared to demonstrate that dignity and respect could not be dismissed based on assumptions about appearance or social status. "I think it's time for everyone here to understand exactly who they've been discriminating against for the past hour and 15 minutes. Damon reached into his black duffel bag with the same calm deliberation he had shown throughout the confrontation, but now there was something in his posture that suggested the passive phase of the interaction was ending, and something more decisive was about to begin. He withdrew his phone and began typing a message with the focused attention of someone communicating with people who had been waiting for his signal. "Captain Mitchell," Damon said into his phone as he placed a call that he put on speaker so everyone present could hear the conversation. "I'm at Denver International Airport Terminal B, Gate B47, and I need you to bring the company jet to my location immediately. Full arrival protocol, make it impressive, and prepare for departure as soon as you can process the flight plan to Atlanta." Emma Chen looked up at Damon with eyes that sparkled with excitement, because even though she was only 9 years old, she understood that important people had their own airplanes, and if the nice runner man was calling his airplane to come get him, that meant he was much more important than the airport people had thought when they were being mean to him. "Is your airplane really coming?" Emma asked, her voice carrying the kind of delighted anticipation that children feel when adult situations suddenly become more interesting than anything they could have imagined. "Yes, Emma, my airplane is coming," Damon replied, his smile genuine as he looked down at the child who had been his most consistent supporter throughout an ordeal that had tested everyone's character in ways that would be remembered long after the flights departed. Sometimes when people treat you badly because they make assumptions about who you are, the best response is to show them exactly who you really are. Brittany Morrison felt something cold settle in her stomach as she processed what she was hearing, because if Damon Washington actually had access to a private jet, then her assumptions about his financial status and social position had been completely wrong, and her treatment of him had been based on prejudice rather than legitimate security concerns or professional judgment about passenger verification procedures. "Sir, anyone can make phone calls claiming to have private aircraft," Brittany said, though her voice carried less conviction than she had managed throughout the earlier confrontation, as if some part of her was beginning to understand that the situation was about to change in ways that would reveal the true cost of her discriminatory assumptions. Jake Sullivan exchanged worried glances with Officer Rodriguez, both men recognizing that if Damon Washington's phone call was legitimate, then the situation was about to transform from routine passenger verification into a public relations and legal disaster that would have consequences extending far beyond their immediate careers in airport security and law enforcement. Tyler Rodriguez had been managing his live stream while simultaneously coordinating with news producers who were requesting permission to use his footage for broader coverage, and the mention of a private jet arriving at the gate had caused his viewer count to surge past 4,000 as social media algorithms recognized and amplified content that was generating intense engagement through shares, comments, and real-time reactions. "Guys, this is absolutely incredible," Tyler whispered into his phone for his audience, which now included reporters from major news outlets who were encouraging him to maintain continuous coverage of what appeared to be building toward a dramatic revelation. The marathon runner just called for his private jet to pick him up at the gate, and if that's real, then everything we've witnessed for the past hour is about to become the most expensive discrimination case in aviation history. Dr. Williams had been documenting the escalation of tensions and management responses, but Damon's phone call suggested that the situation was approaching a conclusion that would either validate all the witness testimony about inappropriate treatment or reveal additional complexities that she hadn't anticipated when she first decided to speak up in defense of appropriate passenger services. Grace Chen squeezed Emma's hand as they both listened to the conversation about airplanes and arrival protocols, and Grace's decades of experience with discrimination told her that they were about to witness either justice being served or institutional authority doubling down on assumptions that would prove catastrophically expensive for everyone who had participated in treating Damon Washington badly. Maya Patel felt her heart racing as she realized that her decision to challenge her supervisor's authority might have been the smartest career move she had ever made, because if Damon Washington was actually wealthy and powerful enough to own a private jet, then standing up for appropriate customer service might protect her job rather than threaten it. Captain Mitchell came a crisp, professional voice through Damon's phone speaker. "This is Captain Sarah Mitchell responding to your request for immediate pickup at Denver International. We can have the Gulfstream at Gate B47 within 12 minutes. Will you require ground transportation to the aircraft, or are you prepared for standard passenger boarding procedures?" Janet Foster felt her knees go weak as she heard the response that confirmed Damon Washington's access to private aviation. Understanding that the discrimination incident she had hoped to manage quietly through diplomatic language and internal review procedures was about to become a public spectacle that could destroy careers and institutional relationships regardless of how carefully she tried to control the damage. "Standard boarding will be fine, Captain Mitchell." Damon replied, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone accustomed to coordinating complex logistics and managing teams of people whose professional competence he relied upon for business operations that affected thousands of employees and billions of dollars in annual revenue. "Please coordinate with ground control for gate positioning that will be visible to passengers in the premium terminal and prepare for immediate departure once I'm aboard." Emma jumped up and down with excitement, clapping her hands as she realized that she was about to see a real private airplane come to pick up her new friend, and something about the child's pure joy in the moment made several nearby passengers smile despite the serious nature of everything that had led to this dramatic development. "Grandma, we're going to see his airplane," Emma announced to Grace, her voice carrying across the terminal with the kind of delighted anticipation that reminded everyone present that they were witnessing something extraordinary unfold in real time. Officer Rodriguez had been observing the phone conversation and the responses of airport staff to Damon's demonstration of resources and authority, and his law enforcement experience told him that the next few minutes would reveal whether institutional discrimination would be acknowledged and addressed or defended through legal positioning that would make everything worse for everyone involved. Brittany Morrison stared at Damon Washington with the expression of someone watching their career disintegrate, in real time understanding that every assumption she had made about his financial status, social position, and right to access premium airport facilities had been not just wrong, but catastrophically wrong, in ways that would have consequences extending far beyond this single interaction. The distant sound of jet engines began to echo through the terminal as Damon Washington's private aircraft approached Gate B47, carrying with it the undeniable proof that dignity and worth cannot be measured by appearance, and that the consequences of discrimination sometimes arrive with the thunderous authority of wealth and power finally given voice to demand the accountability that justice requires. The thunderous roar of twin Pratt & Whitney engines filled Terminal B as the sleek Gulfstream G650 approached Gate B47, its pristine white fuselage gleaming under the airport's floodlights, with the kind of mechanical perfection that speaks to maintenance budgets larger than most people's annual salaries. Along the aircraft's side, in elegant blue lettering that became clearly visible as the jet completed its taxi, the words Washington Logistics Empire were displayed with the understated confidence of a company that had grown from a single food truck to a $8 billion operation without needing to announce itself loudly to be taken seriously. Emma Chen pressed her face against the terminal's floor-to-ceiling windows, her 9-year-old excitement barely contained as she watched the private jet position itself at the gate with the precision of a crew that had performed this procedure hundreds of times at airports around the world. "Grandma, look how big it is." Emma exclaimed, her voice carrying the pure wonder that children bring to experiences that adults have learned to take for granted or analyze through complicated lenses of power and privilege and social dynamics. Grace Chen stood beside her granddaughter with tears forming in her eyes, not from sadness but from the overwhelming sense of justice finally being served to someone who had maintained his dignity throughout an hour of deliberate humiliation designed to make him prove his worth to people who had never bothered to ask his name, before deciding he didn't belong in spaces he had clearly paid to access. Tyler Rodriguez struggled to hold his phone steady as he captured the aircraft's arrival for his live stream audience, which had exploded to over 6,000 viewers, as news outlets, social media influencers, and civil rights advocates shared his documentation across platforms where millions of people were now witnessing what appeared to be one of the most dramatic reversals in discrimination history. "Holy shit, guys, it's real," Tyler whispered into his camera, his voice shaking with the adrenaline of witnessing something that would be remembered and referenced for years as an example of what happens when assumptions about people are proven catastrophically wrong in the most public way possible. That's actually his private jet with his company name on the side, and everyone who spent the past hour treating him like a criminal is about to understand exactly how much this discrimination is going to cost them. The live stream comments had become a waterfall of vindication, legal speculation, and demands for accountability that reflected the collective satisfaction of thousands of people who were watching justice arrive with jet engines and corporate logos that made denying Damon Washington's legitimacy impossible, even for the most determined defenders of discriminatory assumptions. Brittany Morrison stood frozen beside the window, staring at an aircraft that represented the complete destruction of every assumption she had made about Damon Washington's financial status, social position, and right to occupy premium spaces that she had spent 7 years protecting from people who she believed didn't belong there. The corporate logo on the fuselage was large enough to read from inside the terminal, and even someone with no knowledge of logistics companies could recognize that anyone who owned a Gulfstream G650 possessed wealth that made her authority over airport seating arrangements seem ridiculous by comparison. Jake Sullivan backed away from the window with the expression of someone watching his career in airport security evaporate in real time. Understanding that his support for discriminatory passenger verification procedures would be impossible to defend once his supervisors learned that he had helped harass the CEO of a company that probably generated more revenue in a single day than he would earn in his entire working life. Dr. Patricia Williams felt a surge of vindication as she watched the aircraft that validated every concern she had raised about inappropriate passenger treatment. But her medical training in observing human responses to crisis situations made her more interested in documenting how institutional authority reacted when confronted with undeniable evidence that their assumptions had been based on prejudice rather than professional judgment. Maya Patel experienced a mixture of relief and professional satisfaction as she realized that her decision to challenge supervisory authority and stand up for appropriate customer service had been exactly the right choice, not just morally but strategically, because supporting discrimination against someone with Damon Washington's resources and influence would have been career suicide disguised as employee loyalty. The aircraft engines wound down with the mechanical precision of equipment maintained to the highest possible standards, and ground crew members rushed to position the jetway with the efficiency of professionals accustomed to serving passengers whose time was valuable and whose travel schedules often involved business decisions that affected thousands of employees and millions of dollars in corporate operations. Captain Sarah Mitchell appeared at the aircraft door wearing the crisp uniform and confident bearing of someone with military aviation experience who had spent 8 years flying for Washington Logistics Empire and had developed the kind of professional relationship with Damon Washington that was based on mutual respect and shared understanding of what excellence looked like in high-stakes environments where mistakes were expensive and competence was essential. "Good afternoon, Mr. Washington," Captain Mitchell said as she stepped into the terminal, her voice carrying the military precision that had made her one of the most respected corporate pilots in the business aviation industry. "I trust your day in Denver has been productive, though. I understand from Maria Santos that you've encountered some interesting challenges with local customer service standards." Damon smiled for the first time since his conversation with Emma about marathon medals, and running in memory of his mother, and the transformation in his expression reminded everyone present that they had been witnessing someone maintain extraordinary composure under deliberate provocation that would have justified anger from anyone subjected to such obvious unfairness. "Very educational." Captain Mitchell Damon replied, his voice carrying the controlled authority that had guided Washington logistics through 15 years of expansion and competitive challenges in the logistics industry. "Extremely educational in ways that I think will prove valuable for ensuring that other travelers don't face similar educational experiences in the future." Emma Chen bounced on her toes with excitement as she realized that the nice lady in the pilot uniform had come to take her friend home on his beautiful airplane, and something about seeing Damon Washington finally being treated with the respect he deserved made Emma feel like justice was exactly what her grandmother had always taught her it should be. "Mr. Washington, is that really your pilot?" Emma asked, though her voice carried more delight than surprise, because even at 9 years old she could recognize the difference between how Captain Mitchell treated Damon and how the airport people had been treating him for the past hour. "Yes, Emma, that's Captain Mitchell, and she's been flying for my company for 8 years, Damon replied, his voice carrying genuine warmth as he introduced the child who had asked the most important questions of the entire confrontation to the professional who represented what competence and respect looked like when people understood that dignity was not determined by appearance or assumptions. Captain Mitchell looked around the terminal at the crowd of passengers, airport employees, and recording devices that surrounded her passenger, and her military training told her that whatever had transpired during Damon's wait for commercial aviation had created exactly the kind of situation that would require careful documentation and professional handling to ensure that justice was served through appropriate channels. "Mr. Washington, should I prepare for additional passengers? Or will you be traveling alone today?" Captain Mitchell asked, though her tone suggested she already understood that the question was more about making a point for the audience than about actual flight planning. "Just me, Captain, though I suspect some of the folks here will have plenty to discuss with their supervisors and legal representatives." After we depart, Damon replied, his words carrying the controlled intensity of someone who had given institutional authority every opportunity to respond appropriately, and was now prepared to pursue accountability through whatever channels proved necessary for ensuring that other travelers didn't face similar discrimination. Tyler Rodriguez zoomed in with his phone to capture the interaction between Damon and Captain Mitchell, understanding that he was documenting a moment that would be replayed millions of times across social media platforms and news outlets, as an example of what dignity looked like when it was finally treated with the respect it had always deserved. Janet Foster approached the group with the desperate urgency of someone attempting damage control for a situation that had already moved far beyond her ability to manage through diplomatic language and internal review procedures, understanding that her career in airport management might depend on her ability to demonstrate appropriate response to discrimination that had been witnessed and documented by thousands of people. "Mr. Washington, I want to personally apologize for any misunderstandings that may have occurred during your visit to our facility." Janet began using language that was designed to suggest concern without admitting legal liability for actions that would inevitably become evidence in formal proceedings and federal investigations. Damon looked at Janet Foster with the same analytical attention he brought to business negotiations, where other people's responses revealed their priorities and commitment to accountability versus their interest in protecting institutional authority that had enabled discrimination through policies disguised as security procedures. "Ms. Foster, there have been no misunderstandings," Damon replied, his voice carrying the controlled strength that had guided Washington logistics through competitive challenges and regulatory compliance issues that required absolute clarity about facts versus assumptions. What occurred here was deliberate discrimination based on racial assumptions about who belongs in premium aviation facilities, and your staff created exactly the kind of civil rights violation that federal law prohibits in public accommodations. Grace Chen had been watching her granddaughter's reaction to seeing justice finally arrive in the form of a private jet and professional crew who treated Damon Washington with the respect he had deserved from the beginning, and something about Emma's pure joy in witnessing fairness made Grace feel hopeful about a world where children still understood right and wrong more clearly than adults who had learned to accept inappropriate treatment as normal business procedure. Officer Rodriguez had been observing the interaction between airport management and corporate aviation professionals, and his law enforcement experience told him that Damon Washington's resources and influence would ensure that the discrimination incident received exactly the kind of formal review and accountability that such violations deserved under federal civil rights statutes. David Patterson, Skylink Airlines regional director, had been in emergency session with his legal team when his phone began buzzing with urgent notifications about a viral video involving one of his terminal facilities and what appeared to be clear racial discrimination against a passenger who was now being identified across social media as the CEO of a major logistics company. David was 58 years old with gray hair and the kind of crisis management experience that came from 30 years in airline operations. But as he watched Tyler Rodriguez's live stream and processed the legal implications of what his employees had done, he understood that this situation would either be resolved through immediate accountability or would destroy careers and institutional relationships, regardless of how carefully they tried to control the damage. "Get me a direct line to whoever is in charge at Denver Terminal B," David told his assistant as he grabbed his jacket and headed for the door, understanding that the next hour would determine whether Skylink Airlines survived this crisis with its reputation intact, or became another case study in how institutional discrimination could destroy companies that failed to address bias when it was exposed through viral documentation. The phone in Janet Foster's hand rang with the distinctive tone that indicated calls from senior airline management, and as she saw David Patterson's name on her caller ID, Janet felt her stomach drop with the recognition that corporate leadership was already aware of the situation, and that her handling of the discrimination incident was about to be evaluated by people whose decisions could end careers with a single phone call. "David, I was just about to contact you about a passenger service issue that requires management attention," Janet began, though her voice carried the hollow authority of someone trying to control a situation that had already moved far beyond her influence. "Janet, I'm watching a live stream of your passenger service issue, and what I'm seeing is the most expensive discrimination case in our company's history being broadcast to thousands of viewers, while our employee makes statements that will be impossible to defend in court." David Patterson's voice came through the phone speaker clearly enough for everyone in the immediate area to hear, including the multiple recording devices that were preserving every word for legal proceedings and news coverage. Brittany Morrison felt her legs give out as she realized that regional airline management was already aware of her handling of the passenger verification procedures, and that her 7-year career with Skylink Airlines had just ended in the most public and professionally destructive way possible. "David, I was following established security protocols for passengers who don't meet standard profiles for premium service access," Brittany said, though her voice carried the desperate authority of someone whose professional justifications were being dismantled by people who understood the difference between legitimate security procedures and discriminatory assumptions disguised as policy enforcement. "Ms. Morrison, there are no security protocols that authorize racial profiling, and there are no company policies that permit employees to discriminate against passengers based on appearance." David Patterson's voice carried clearly through the phone speaker, with the controlled fury of someone whose company was facing federal investigation and million-dollar lawsuits because of employee actions that violated every principle of appropriate customer service and legal compliance. Tyler Rodriguez had positioned his phone to capture the phone conversation between airport management and airline executives, understanding that he was documenting the real-time termination of employees whose discriminatory actions had been exposed through witness testimony and viral video coverage that would serve as evidence in legal proceedings and federal investigations. "Ms. Morrison, Officer Sullivan, your employment with Skylink Airlines is terminated. Effective immediately. David Patterson continued his words, hitting the terminated employees like physical blows as they realized that their careers in aviation had just ended because of assumptions and biases that they had never bothered to examine or question when they were applied to passengers who deserved better treatment. Emma Chen looked up at her grandmother with confusion about why the grown-ups were talking about people losing their jobs. But something about the serious tone of the conversation told Emma that the airport people who had been mean to the nice runner man were finally facing consequences for treating someone badly without any good reason. "Grandma, does this mean the mean lady won't be able to be mean to other people at the airport anymore?" Emma asked, her 9-year-old understanding of justice focusing on the most important outcome from her perspective, which was ensuring that other travelers wouldn't face the same unfair treatment that she had witnessed being applied to someone who had done absolutely nothing wrong. "Yes, sweetheart. I think that's exactly what it means," Grace replied, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had witnessed accountability being applied to institutional authority that had enabled discrimination through policies and procedures that prioritized assumptions over evidence and bias over fairness. Dr. Williams had been documenting the management response and employee terminations, understanding that her medical training in crisis intervention and evidence preservation had prepared her to serve as a credible witness in legal proceedings that would likely develop from the incident and require detailed testimony about exactly what had been said and done by each participant. Maya Patel felt a mixture of relief and vindication as she realized that her decision to challenge supervisory authority and stand up for appropriate passenger treatment had protected her career rather than threatened it, because supporting discrimination against someone with Damon Washington's resources and influence would have been professional suicide disguised as employee loyalty to supervisors who had created legal liability through inappropriate customer service. Officer Rodriguez had been observing the interaction between terminated employees and airline management, and his law enforcement experience told him that the swift accountability being applied to discriminatory behavior represented exactly the kind of institutional response that federal civil rights enforcement was designed to encourage through legal consequences and financial penalties that made discrimination expensive for organizations that failed to address bias when it was identified. Jake Sullivan stared at his former supervisor with the expression of someone whose career in airport security had just ended because he had confused supporting authority with supporting inappropriate behavior. Understanding that his decision to validate discriminatory assumptions rather than question them had cost him employment in an industry where professional judgment was supposed to be based on evidence rather than bias. Captain Mitchell had been observing the corporate response to discrimination that had been exposed through viral documentation, and her military aviation experience told her that swift accountability was essential for maintaining institutional credibility when employee actions violated fundamental principles of appropriate service and legal compliance that governed operations in regulated industries. "Mr. Washington, if you're ready for departure, we can have you airborne within 15 minutes. Captain Mitchell said, her voice carrying the professional competence that represented what excellence looked like when people understood that dignity was not negotiable and respect was not conditional on appearance or assumptions about social status. Damon Washington looked around the terminal at the faces of passengers who had witnessed an hour of discrimination followed by swift accountability, and something about the mixture of shame, understanding, and hope in their expressions told him that the educational value of what had transpired might extend far beyond the immediate participants to influence how people thought about fairness and justice in institutional spaces where authority could either protect dignity or destroy it. "Actually, Captain Mitchell, I think we should take a moment for some final observations before we depart," Damon said, his voice carrying the controlled authority of someone who understood that teachable moments were rare and valuable and should be used to maximum effect for creating understanding rather than just demonstrating power. Emma Chen had been watching all the grown-ups deal with consequences and accountability, but what impressed her most about the entire situation was how the nice runner man had stayed calm and kind throughout everything that had happened to him, even when people were being unfair and mean for no good reason that she could understand. Mr. Washington. Emma said, her voice carrying the innocent directness that had cut through adult complications throughout the confrontation. I'm glad your airplane came to get you, and I'm glad the mean people can't be mean to other travelers anymore, but I'm mostly glad that you stayed nice even when they weren't nice to you. That's what my grandma says brave people do. Damon looked down at Emma Chen with an expression of such genuine affection and gratitude that several nearby passengers felt tears forming in their eyes, understanding that they were witnessing something profound about innocence and wisdom, and the power of maintaining character when circumstances test everything you believe about dignity and justice, and the importance of treating other people with respect, regardless of their appearance or your assumptions about who they are or what they deserve. 3 months later, Damon Washington returned to Denver International Airport for a speaking engagement about corporate leadership and social responsibility at the Colorado Business Ethics Conference, and as his commercial flight, he had specifically chosen to fly Skylink Airlines to demonstrate that institutional change was possible, descended toward the same terminal where his dignity had been tested and ultimately vindicated. He reflected on how quickly organizations could transform when they committed to accountability rather than defensiveness. The premium terminal had been renamed the Dignity Lounge, with brass plaques near the entrance featuring quotes about respect and fairness from civil rights leaders who had understood that justice required constant vigilance and the courage to challenge assumptions that masqueraded as policies. Staff members throughout the facility now wore badges with the Washington Foundation's motto, "Respect is not earned by appearance, but guaranteed by humanity." And every employee had completed comprehensive bias training that used real examples, including video footage from Damon's discrimination incident, to help people understand the difference between security procedures and prejudicial assumptions. Emma Chen and her grandmother Grace were waiting near the gate when Damon's flight arrived, and the 9-year-old girl, who was now 10, ran toward him with the uninhibited joy of someone greeting a friend whose character had been tested and proven worthy of trust and admiration. Emma had become something of a local hero at her elementary school, where her teacher had used her questions during the airport incident as examples of how children often understood fairness more clearly than adults who had learned to accept inappropriate behavior as normal institutional procedure. "Mr. Washington, Mr. Washington," Emma called out as she reached him, her voice carrying the same delighted excitement she had shown when his private jet had arrived to collect him after an hour of discrimination that had been transformed into a teaching moment about dignity and accountability. "I've been telling everyone at school about how you stayed nice even when the airport people were being mean, and my teacher says that's called integrity." Grace Chen approached more slowly, but her smile carried the satisfaction of someone who had witnessed justice being served and had seen her granddaughter learn important lessons about standing up for what was right, even when authority figures seemed to support what was wrong. "Mr. Washington, thank you for agreeing to meet with Emma before your speech. She's been looking forward to this for weeks." Damon knelt down to Emma's eye-level, understanding that children deserved the same respect and attention that adults expected, and that some of the most important conversations happened when people took time to listen to perspectives that hadn't been complicated by years of institutional conditioning and social assumptions that could cloud moral clarity. "Emma, your grandmother tells me that you've been talking to other kids about what happened here," Damon said, his voice carrying the same gentle attention he had shown during their first conversation about marathon medals and running in memory of his mother. "What do you think is the most important thing for people to remember about that day?" Emma considered the question with the seriousness that children bring to discussions they recognize as important. And when she answered, her words carried the kind of moral clarity that adults often lost, but could rediscover if they listened carefully to voices that hadn't learned to compromise fundamental principles for the sake of social convenience or institutional loyalty. "I think the most important thing is that everyone deserves to be treated nicely, no matter what they look like, or what clothes they're wearing, Emma said, her voice carrying across the gate area where other passengers had stopped to listen to a conversation between a CEO and a child who had both played crucial roles in exposing discrimination and ensuring accountability. And I think grown-ups should remember that kids can see when something isn't fair, even if we don't understand all the big words that adults use to make unfair things sound okay. Maya Patel, who had been promoted to customer service director with specific responsibility for ensuring equal treatment of all passengers, regardless of appearance or perceived social status, approached the group with the confident bearing of someone whose career had been enhanced, rather than threatened by her decision to challenge discriminatory behavior when she witnessed it. "Mr. Washington, welcome back to Denver International," Maya said, extending her hand with genuine respect and professional pride. "I want you to know that we've implemented every recommendation from your foundation's report, and discrimination complaints have decreased by 87%, while customer satisfaction scores have improved across all demographic categories." Tyler Rodriguez, now a senior at the University of Colorado with a journalism degree nearly complete and internship offers from major news networks based on his real-time documentation of institutional discrimination, had been invited to moderate a panel discussion about social media's role in exposing bias and ensuring accountability in public accommodations. "Mr. Washington, when I started streaming that day, I was just a college student with a phone and a sense that something wrong was happening." Tyler said, his voice carrying the maturity that comes from understanding how individual actions can influence broader conversations about justice and fairness. "What I learned is that documentation and witnesses can transform discrimination from a private injustice into a public teaching moment, but only if people are willing to speak up when they see inappropriate treatment." Dr. Patricia Williams had flown from Atlanta specifically to attend Damon's presentation about corporate responsibility and individual courage, and her presence represented the network of witnesses who had been changed by their decision to challenge authority rather than remain silent while watching discrimination unfold in front of them. "Mr. Washington, watching you maintain dignity under pressure taught me that integrity isn't just about personal character. It's about creating space for other people to find their own courage to do what's right," Dr. Williams said, her voice carrying the professional authority that had been enhanced rather than threatened by her decision to document and challenge inappropriate behavior when she witnessed it. Grace Chen watched her granddaughter interact with adults who treated her opinions and observations as valuable contributions to important conversations. Understanding that Emma's questions during the discrimination incident had taught everyone present that moral clarity often came from perspectives that hadn't been complicated by institutional conditioning and social assumptions that could obscure fundamental principles of fairness and respect. 6 months after the incident that had transformed discrimination into education and accountability into institutional change, Damon Washington stood before the International Aviation Industry Ethics Conference as the keynote speaker for a presentation titled "Dignity in Transit: How Individual Character Can Transform Institutional Culture." The audience included airline executives, airport managers, and customer service professionals from around the world who had come to understand how quickly viral documentation could expose bias, and how effectively swift accountability could prevent discrimination lawsuits and federal investigations. Emma Chen, now 11 years old, and accompanied by her grandmother Grace, had been invited to introduce Damon's presentation as the youngest speaker ever to address the aviation industry conference, and her presence on the stage represented the power of innocent questions to expose adult complications that masqueraded as professional procedures. "My name is Emma Chen, and I'm here to introduce my friend Mr. Washington, who taught me that staying nice when other people aren't being nice is one of the most important things you can do," Emma said, her voice carrying clearly across the conference center as aviation professionals listened to moral guidance from someone whose perspective hadn't been compromised by institutional conditioning or career considerations. "He also taught me that sometimes kids can see things that grown-ups miss, like when people are being unfair, but using big words to make it sound okay," Damon took the podium with the same composed authority he had shown throughout his ordeal at Denver International Airport, and his opening words carried the wisdom that comes from transforming personal injustice into broader understanding about dignity, respect, and the institutional changes that can prevent other travelers from facing similar discrimination. Ladies and gentlemen, 9 months ago, I completed the Denver Marathon in memory of my mother who built our family business from a single food truck. Through determination, integrity, and unwavering belief that success was measured not by what you accumulated, but by how you treated people who couldn't do anything for you in return. Damon began his voice carrying across the conference center with the emotional weight of someone whose personal story had become a catalyst for industry-wide reform. The presentation continued for 45 minutes, during which Damon shared specific examples of how institutional bias could be identified and addressed through employee training, witness testimony, and accountability procedures that prioritized fairness over authority and justice over convenience. Video clips from Tyler Rodriguez's live stream were shown as case studies in how social media documentation could expose discrimination and ensure that inappropriate treatment had consequences for organizations that failed to address bias when it was identified through witness reports and viral coverage. Tyler Rodriguez, now a recent journalism graduate with a full-time position at a major news network based on his reputation for real-time documentation of social justice issues, had been invited to participate in a panel discussion about the role of citizen journalism in holding institutions accountable for discriminatory behavior that might otherwise go unchallenged and unreported. What I learned that day at Denver International is that everyone with a phone has the power to document injustice and amplify voices that might otherwise be ignored, Tyler said, addressing an audience of aviation professionals who had been forced to confront how quickly inappropriate employee behavior could become viral. Content that damaged reputations and triggered federal investigations. But documentation is only valuable if people are willing to act on what they see, and that requires courage from witnesses who might prefer to remain uninvolved rather than challenge authority. Grace Chen had volunteered with the Washington Foundation's Airport Advocacy Program, which trained travelers to recognize and report discriminatory treatment while providing support for passengers who faced bias based on appearance, accent, or assumptions about their right to access services they had legitimately purchased. Her work represented the transformation of witness experience into ongoing advocacy that prevented other families from experiencing the kind of treatment that Emma had been forced to observe and question. Dr. Patricia Williams had incorporated bias recognition and intervention training into her medical practice's diversity program. Understanding that the principles she had learned about challenging discrimination in airport settings applied equally to healthcare environments where assumptions about patients could affect quality of care and treatment outcomes in ways that violated professional ethics and legal requirements. The conference concluded with commitments from major airlines to implement comprehensive bias training programs, establish independent review boards for discrimination complaints, and create partnerships with civil rights organizations to monitor progress and ensure accountability for institutions that served the traveling public. As Damon prepared to board his commercial flight home to Atlanta, Emma approached him one final time with a drawing she had created specifically for the occasion. A picture of an airplane surrounded by people of different colors and backgrounds, all smiling and holding hands with the words, "Everyone belongs," written in careful 11-year-old handwriting across the top. Mr. Washington, I made this for you to remember that sometimes the most important lessons come from people who are brave enough to stay kind, when other people forget how Emma said, presenting her artwork with the solemnity that children bring to gifts they consider significant and meaningful. Damon accepted the drawing with genuine emotion, understanding that Emma's perspective had been crucial for exposing the discrimination he had experienced, and that her questions had helped other witnesses find the courage to challenge authority when it violated fundamental principles of fairness and respect that should govern how institutions treat people regardless of their appearance or assumptions about their social status. The story of what happened at Denver International Airport became a watershed moment in aviation industry training, referenced in corporate diversity programs and civil rights education, as an example of how individual dignity, witness courage, and swift accountability could transform discrimination into lasting institutional change. Emma Chen's questions about fairness became teaching tools used in elementary schools across the country, reminding children and adults that moral clarity often comes from perspectives unburdened by complicated justifications for treating people unequally. Tyler Rodriguez's documentation proved that citizen journalism could hold powerful institutions accountable in real time, demonstrating how social media platforms could amplify justice when witnesses chose courage over comfort and documentation over silence. The incident established legal precedent for discrimination cases involving public accommodations and became required study material for airport security training programs worldwide. Most importantly, Damon Washington's response to deliberate mistreatment showed that dignity is not determined by others' assumptions, that respect cannot be conditional on appearance, and that sometimes justice arrives not through revenge, but through education that transforms the hearts and policies of institutions that serve the traveling public. The lesson echoes still worth is not negotiable. Character is not conditional, and change is possible when good people refuse to let discrimination go unchallenged. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel and share it with someone who needs to hear that their dignity matters, because every day in airports and institutions across this country, people are fighting for the simple right to be treated with respect. Together, we can build a world where no one has to prove they belong in spaces they've rightfully earned access to, where children's questions about fairness are answered with action rather than excuses, and where justice belongs to everyone, regardless of how they look or what they wear.